It just makes me angry. I'm not angry. Hello and welcome back to my channel. You may have seen my first video, Why I'm No Longer Woke. But if you haven't, that's fine. Don't watch it then. Today's episode is going to be looking at Umberto Eco's 14 Points of Fascism, also known as Ur-Fascism. And the reason why I want to look into it with you today is because I have a slight suspicion that most people in today's society doesn't really know what fascism is. And the reason why I think that is because I think people use it as a synonym for someone they don't like or agree with, which is not what fascism is. Fascism is very, very specific, and I think it's very important that we are able to identify what true fascism is in order to be able to stop it if it actually happens. So, this is a series. It's so dense. It's got so many layers, and I want to take our time with it. I want us to have a discussion about it. What I will say as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in this area. There's going to be a lot of references to the Age of Enlightenment, to traditionalism, to liberalism, such concepts like that, which I was just not familiar with when I was reading through it for the first 20 times. I'm up for being corrected. I'm up for your opinions as well on what we think this might mean, each of these points. So if you have something to say, if you have something to add, please do put them in the comments. So one of the things I'd like to do before we begin is to clarify some terms that Eco uses. When Eco refers to traditionalism, he's not referring to conservatism in our modern understanding of the word. What he is referencing in particular is pre-Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, which was a cultural and philosophical movement that emerged roughly late 17th century in Western Europe and reached its peak in the 18th century. The Age of Enlightenment had its sources in ancient Greek philosophy, the Renaissance period of the 14th to 17th century, and the scientific revolution of the 16th century. So the key philosophical underpinnings of the Enlightenment was that the pursuit of knowledge and freedom could be achieved through rational thought and critical thinking over blind faith and emotionally reactive responses to the unknown. In layman's terms, just think of Professor X from X-Men. Just think of his values. That's what fascism doesn't like. Critical thinking, rational thought, thinking before acting, all that kind of stuff. So that's what he means by traditionalism, is basically the antithesis or pre-enlightenment. Professor, oh my God. You know what I mean. So when Eco refers to modernity or modern culture, he is referring to the culture that emerged from the Enlightenment era. So think of ever progressing technological advancements, the encouragement of discussion and discovery through academia, and the free expression through art and literature. When he talks about modernity or modern, that's what he's referring to. When Eco refers to liberalism, please don't think of the Democrat Party or Labour Party. Liberalism is also a philosophical and it's a political and moral philosophy is what I'm trying to say, that emerged within the Age of Enlightenment. Here's a Wikipedia screenshot. So based on the rights of the individual, liberty, consent of the governed, political equality, the right to private property, and equality before the law. So now we've got those sorted. Let's actually now look at the piece. Thank you for your patience. What we're going to do is we're going to read through the point and then we're going to sort of just break it down. So the first feature of fascism is the cult of tradition. Traditionalism is, of course, much older than fascism. Not only was it typical of counter-revolutionary Catholic thought after the French Revolution, but it was born in the late Hellenistic era as a reaction to classical Greek rationalism. Please don't get lost. I will help you break this down because this was confusing to me. I had to read this a million times before understanding it, so stay with me. In the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions, most of them indulgently accepted by the Roman pantheon, started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history. This revelation, according to the traditionalist mystique, had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the Celtic runes, in the scrolls of the little-known religions of Asia. The first thing that popped into my mind, with fascist movements, there tends to be a rose-tinted perspective of the past, or more specifically, the pre-Enlightenment past. So the Italians really idealized Rome, the Germans, or the Nazis I should say, romanticized pastoral Germany, in the face of a rapidly modernizing West. So the era of like farming, tight-knit communities, and the reward for grueling hard work. So think of like feet in the ground, hands in the earth type of work. And Hitler appealed to a lot of farmers, so it makes sense that he would emphasize that aesthetic. So there's definitely a theme of looking at the past, which obviously that doesn't mean that necessarily just because you're romanticizing a particular era of the past, it means that you're just like automatically fascist. Like, for example, I love the Tudor period. I obviously understand that it was a very difficult time for many reasons, but there's something about like the outfits, the aesthetics, the dances, the courting culture is very romantic in my perspective. But that does not mean I'm a fascist if I stand up and say, hey, I think women should go back to wearing dresses from the 1640s because I think they're cute. So I think the mistake here is to assume that just because someone is harkening back to a particular era or healthily criticizing the Enlightenment for that matter, doesn't automatically make them a fascist. This is what's called a hyponymy, which will come across multiple times in this text. So an example of a hyponymy is a tulip is a type of flower, but not all flowers are tulips, or a robin is a type of bird, but not all birds are robins. So in this case, fascism harkens back and romanticizes a particular past culture or era in pre-Enlightenment history, but harkening back and romanticizing a particular past culture or pre-Enlightenment era is not in of itself fascist. Capiche? So, what I find particularly interesting is the quote: "In the Mediterranean basin, people of different religions, most of them indulgently accepted by the Roman pantheon, started dreaming of a revelation received at the dawn of human history." So there's a nostalgia there, a sensation that in our progress we have overlooked something integral to who we are as human beings, and therefore there needs to be a way of bringing that back. So this revelation, according to the traditionalist mystique, had remained for a long time concealed under the veil of forgotten languages in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in the Celtic runes, and the scrolls of the little-known religions of Asia. So aside from the repetition of rediscovering and utilizing something ancient that unifies us as humans, but there's this idea that has remained for a long time concealed. So there's this idea that this movement, this fascist movement, is uncovering something that has been overlooked, that hasn't been analyzed in this way before. So they're supposedly providing some new groundbreaking interpretation of the past. So you, as a fascist movement, in its conceptual form, are harkening back or romanticizing a particular time, probably pre-Enlightenment era, picking from a particular thought, or maybe you are romanticizing ancient cultures or traditions or tribes or whatever it is. And I think actually that's a good point. I don't think it has to be European either. I think it just so happened that for the Italians, it was the Romans, which just happened to be that that was the nation's cultural history. But I think now, in the time where we have a lot more global connection, I think it's perfectly possible for fascist movements to hearken to other cultural traditions or aesthetics. Like maybe we had overlooked this particular tradition or cultural thing or thought. So I think that's something that I would keep in mind, is that fascism won't necessarily appear in the same way that it did before, because it tends to breed from what's popular in the current culture at the time. Does that make sense? For the Italians at the time, very nation, everywhere actually in Europe was very nation or nationalistic, nation focused. He continues on to be a bit more specific in how this new culture, which includes romanticizing a particular ancient or past culture or belief system, becomes fascistic. He says that this new culture has to be syncretistic. Syncretism is not only, as a dictionary says, the combination of different forms of belief or practice. Such a combination must tolerate contradictions. Each of the original messages contains a silver, I think that's meant to say sliver, of wisdom, and whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, it is only because all are alluding allegorically to the same primeval truth. So let's break this down. So in order for this to be used fascistically, it must be syncretistic. So Eco defines syncretism as the combination of different forms of belief or practice, but I've provided the Oxford definition too, which is the amalgamation or attempted amalgamation of different religions, cultures, or schools of thought. You're welcome. Once again, we've come across another hyponymy. He stresses that fascism uses syncretism, but syncretism isn't in of itself fascist. What makes it fascist is that there's a mixing of different schools of thoughts or cultures or religions, but such a combination must tolerate contradictions. So even if these two cultures, these two religions, these two or more schools of thought don't really make sense together, or they contradict each other in some way, or they don't get along. You have to just tolerate that contradiction. One of the justifications that fascism will give is that it's because it's alluding, it's allegorical, it harkens back to a primeval truth. And, if you try and make sense of it in a logical way, then you're limiting yourself, of course. And then Eco goes on to say, as a consequence, there can be no advancement of learning. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. So you cannot consciously or outwardly express how these things don't make sense, or don't go together well, because you have to tolerate it. There is no option. So internally, you're going to be constantly, even after this fascist movement has been and gone, interpreting its obscure message. It's just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so he gives some examples as well later on this point, as you can see. So one has only to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi Gnosis, I think that's how you say it, was nourished by traditionalist, syncretistic, occult elements. The Nazis, and this is one of the lesser known facts about the Nazis, they were obsessed with the occult. So Himmler had his own occult library, and Goebbels even attempted to use astrology for propaganda purposes. But obviously, the German people weren't allowed to use astrology because they genuinely believed in its power. But I don't know, that feels very contradictory considering how technological and future-driven the Nazis were, but hey-ho. So Eco then says the most influential theoretical source of the theories of the new Italian right, so this is now talking about the fascist movement in Italy, Julius Evola merged the Holy Grail with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, alchemy with the Holy Roman and Germanic Empire. So it's two contradictory schools of thought that don't really mesh, but they did it anyway. The very fact that the Italian right, in order to show its open-mindedness, recently broadened its syllabus to include works by De Maistre, Guénon, and Gramsci is a blatant proof of syncretism. So they might try to market it as open-mindedness as a way to appear more palatable, and then to coerce their subjects into accepting the contradictions in their syncretism. Okay, so moving on. So if you browse in the shelves that in American bookstores are labeled as New Age, you can find there even St. Augustine, who, as far as I know, was not a fascist. But combining St. Augustine and Stonehenge, that is a symptom of fascism. He sort of emphasizes that point there of the subjects in isolation, whether it's two cultures, two religions, two schools of thought. They, in isolation, aren't necessarily fascist, but it's the mixing and forced tolerance of these contradictory points that makes it fascist. So to summarize point one, let's do it. Is this idea of romanticizing an era or a culture or a religion or school of thought and then trying to mix it in with the present culture and justifying its contradictory nature by marketing it as open-mindedness. If you basically what they're saying is that, well, if only you were open-minded enough, you would accept this and tolerate the contradictions because the truth has already been spelled out for us. There's no denying this is the truth. There we go. So that's the first point of fascism. Okay, let's go on to number two. I think I'm going to do either 3 or 4 points today. I'll see how well I do. So two, traditionalism implies the rejection of modernism. Both fascists and Nazis worshipped technology, while traditionalist thinkers usually reject it as a negation of traditional spiritual values. Yeah, so there's a contradiction there. So both fascists and Nazis worship technology. But if you think about pre-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment likes technology. It likes the sort of progression of research and thought and everything. So there's a sort of contradiction there. So, however, even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of an ideology based upon blood and earth. The rejection of the modern world was disguised as a rebuttal of the capitalistic way of life, but it mainly concerned the rejection of the spirit of 1789 and 1776, of course. Duh. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Wow. So let's just break this down. I do want to say, before we continue, that this document has been really difficult to deconstruct because it's quite dense and uses a lot of academic language that's challenging to translate into layman. And I'm very out of practice. But just so you're aware of my process here, I'm trying to apply these points to a modern context because it's so easy to apply it and see it in the context of the time, or the context of Italian fascism, or the Nazi era of the 30s and 40s. But I don't think we can interpret fascism without the context of the time in mind. And if that context has changed, which obviously it has, we're not in the same place that we were in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the 1920s, 40s. Then I believe that the way that fascism will materialize or express itself is going to be different too. So as well as tackling this dense text, I'm simultaneously brainstorming how I think this could look in our present day and age. And I would love to hear what you think as well, if anyone's got any ideas or has a sort of light bulb moment. Let's just continue with our interpretation the best we can. And I'm always open to other people's interpretations, obviously. So the way that I interpreted this particular point was that fascism is a bit of a shapeshifter and is very deceptive by nature. So the bit that stuck out to me was this point where he says, even though Nazism was proud of its industrial achievements, its praise of modernism was only the surface of an ideology based upon blood and earth. So there's this idea of a mask being used. So the rejection of the modern world was disguised as a rebuttal of capitalistic way of life, but it mainly concerned itself with the rejection of the spirit of 1789 and of 1776, of course, aka something else. There's a sort of front-facing expression of the ideology that people can see, but in reality, there's something else working behind the scenes. So it's quite difficult, it's quite slippery. And it will put on different disguises in order to perhaps appeal to a certain demographic, when in reality it's masking their true motives. Very deceptive. I had to do a bit of digging in regards to what Eco meant by the spirit of 1789 and 1776. I already knew that 1789 references the French Revolution and 1776 references the American Revolution, but I'll admit I was initially having trouble with identifying the philosophical through line between these two revolutions in particular. So thankfully, Eco gives us a clue in his finishing two sentences. The Enlightenment, the age of reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. With earlier reference to 1789 and 1776, fascism actively undermines values of the Enlightenment, but specifically the qualities which encouraged reason over feelings, critical thinking, and debating rights over authority and faith, etc., etc. So fascist philosophy is therefore irrational by nature and romanticizes a pre-Enlightenment order, which is far more emotionally charged, where rational discourse was yet to be embedded or guaranteed as a societal value. Where Enlightenment thought said, let's reason our way to truth, fascism says, truth is felt, not reasoned. So that's, I think, all I can say about number 2. So I think we should go on to number 3. So irrationalism also depends on the cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. Therefore, culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. Distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of Ur-Fascism, from Goering's alleged statement, when I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun, to the frequent use of such expressions as degenerate intellectuals, eggheads, effete snobs, universities are a nest of reds. The official fascist intellectuals were mainly engaged in attacking modern culture and the liberal intelligentsia for having betrayed traditional values. Irrationalism is the idea that you put feelings and other people's opinions over logic and critical thinking. And Eco expands on that in point 3. So he says irrationalism depends on the cult of action for action's sake. So action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. So there is a mobilization of the populace to take action before thinking, driven primarily by an emotional reaction. Thinking as a form of emasculation, because obviously action is traditionally associated with the masculine. So therefore being inactive, in theory, or sitting back and contemplating your philosophy or testing that against alternative ways of thinking rather than beating the opposition away with irrational violence or clutching your ears in fear is seen as an emasculation. Therefore, culture is suspect insofar as it is identified with critical attitudes. So a truly diverse culture that encourages critical attitudes or critical thinking is suspect in the eyes of fascism. Distrust of the intellectual world has always been a symptom of Ur-Fascism, from Goering's alleged statement, when I hear talk of culture, I reach for my gun, to the frequent use of such expressions as degenerate intellectuals, eggheads, effete snobs, universities are a nest of reds. So yeah, there's an undermining of intellectualism in some way, because true intellectualism involves critical thinking. There may also be a manipulation of intellectual subjects, such as history or science or biology or philosophy, because obviously the idea of sitting down and debating and discussing and using your critical thinking skills is a threat. For fascism, they want you to be emotional automatons. If something offends you, fascism wants you to react immediately without hesitation. So I think this point is particularly pretty I, I think this point is pretty self-explanatory. So I will. Shall I move into point 4?
I think you should tease point 4.
All right, cool. So I will move on to point 4, but I will actually, I think, stop it here for now. Obviously, if you feel like I've missed something in my interpretations, feel free to comment below. So what I think so far is, I think it's pretty clear that from the first 3, we have this idea that fascism is something that romanticizes the pre-Enlightenment era, and it romanticizes the idea that critical thinking, the ability to have respectful disagreements with your opposition, is somehow not a good thing.
Come on.
I'm trying. I am trying. I said how difficult I was finding this and I need help. Okay, so we've gone through 3 out of 14 points. I will be doing part 2 at some point where I'll go through point 4, 5, 6, 7, continue to break these down because I think this is really, really important. So, what we've learned so far is that fascism romanticizes pre Enlightenment values. It does not tolerate critical thinking abilities or their people to have critical thinking abilities. They want you to be emotional automatons. They want you to tolerate contradictions. They want you to, in their own ideology or in their own doctrine, they want you to react before thinking, and is distinctly anti-intellectual by nature. So I think so far that gives a really interesting introduction to what fascism is, and I very much look forward to going through the rest with you guys. So thank you so much for listening. And if any of you have any sort of thoughts or ideas, or maybe something I've missed that you think is important to highlight, I implore you to please put them in the comments and I can always read them out and discuss those in depth as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time for part 2. Jack!